In the early hours of June 22, 1941, as darkness still cloaked the eastern horizon, the greatest military invasion in human history was about to begin. Along an 1,800-mile front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, more than 3.8 million German and Axis soldiers stood ready. Thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft prepared to unleash devastation on an unsuspecting enemy. This was Operation Barbarossa, Adolf Hitler's audacious plan to conquer the Soviet Union in a single, decisive blow. It would open the Eastern Front, the largest and deadliest theater of World War II, where more people would die than in all other theaters of the war combined. But what began as Germany's most spectacular military advance would end in catastrophic failure just 5 months later, transforming the course of the Second World War and ultimately sealing Nazi Germany's fate. This is the story of ambition, miscalculation, and brutal warfare on an unprecedented scale. This is the story of Operation Barbarossa. To understand Operation Barbarossa, we must first understand the strange partnership that preceded it. In August 1939, the world watched in stunned disbelief as Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, two nations with diametrically opposed ideologies, signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that shocked even their closest allies. For Britain and France, who had hoped to contain Hitler's ambitions, this diplomatic earthquake changed everything. The pact wasn't just about non-aggression. It included secret protocols that carved up Eastern Europe between the two powers, condemning Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania to occupation and destruction. But for Adolf Hitler, this pact was never meant to last. It was merely a tactical maneuver, buying time for what he had always intended, the destruction of the Soviet Union and the communist ideology he so despised. Hitler's obsession with conquering the Soviet Union was a sudden decision made in the heat of war. It was an ideological cornerstone he had outlined as early as 1925 in his manifesto Mein Kampf. He believed that the German people needed lebensraum, living space, to thrive for generations to come. And in his twisted worldview, this living space could only be found in the vast territories of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. To Hitler, the Slavic peoples were racially inferior, the Soviet system was weak and rotten, and the destruction of Bolshevism was Germany's historic destiny. He famously declared his belief that they only needed to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. By the summer of 1940, with France defeated and Britain isolated, Hitler felt the time had come to turn his attention eastward. He believed that conquering the Soviet Union would serve multiple purposes. It would eliminate the communist threat, provide Germany with unlimited resources and agricultural land, and force Britain to surrender once they realized Germany controlled all of continental Europe. On December 18, 1940, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 21, the formal order for the invasion of the Soviet Union. He renamed the Operation Barbarossa after the medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who had led the Third Crusade. For Hitler, the symbolism was clear. This would be a crusade to establish Germanic dominance in the East for 1,000 years. The plan was breathtakingly ambitious. German forces would be divided into 3 massive army groups. Army Group North would drive toward Leningrad. Army Group South would conquer Ukraine and push toward Kiev, and the most powerful force, Army Group Center, would advance through Belarus toward Moscow, the Soviet capital. The German High Command believed the Red Army could be defeated in just 8 to 12 weeks. They estimated that by October, German forces would have reached a line stretching from Archangel in the north to Astrakhan in the south, effectively conquering the European part of the Soviet Union. This confidence wasn't entirely unfounded. The German military had perfected Blitzkrieg warfare, lightning war, characterized by rapid, coordinated attacks using tanks, aircraft, and motorized infantry. They had used these tactics to devastating effect in Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. Why wouldn't they work in Russia? But there was a problem. The German generals and Hitler himself were making catastrophic assumptions. They underestimated the Soviet Union's vast size, its population, its industrial capacity, and most critically, the determination of its people to defend their homeland. Despite repeated warnings from multiple sources, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin refused to believe that Hitler would break their pact. British intelligence, decrypted German communications, and even a Chinese spy had all warned of the impending invasion. Winston Churchill personally sent Stalin a letter in April 1941 warning of German preparations. But Stalin dismissed these warnings as British tricks designed to drag the Soviet Union into the war. He trusted the non-aggression pact and believed Hitler wouldn't be foolish enough to fight a two-front war while Britain remained undefeated. This denial would prove catastrophic. When the invasion finally came, the Red Army was caught completely unprepared, with units scattered, supplies depleted, and commanders uncertain how to respond. Operation Barbarossa was originally scheduled to begin on May 15, 1941, but in early April, Hitler made a decision that would have profound consequences. When Yugoslavia's government was overthrown in a coup, Hitler flew into one of his infamous rages. Feeling personally insulted, he diverted forces meant for Barbarossa to invade Yugoslavia and Greece. The Balkan campaign was successful but costly. It delayed Operation Barbarossa by 5 crucial weeks. Those weeks would prove decisive when winter arrived earlier than expected, with German forces still fighting for Moscow. At exactly 4:15 on the morning of June 22, 1941, the largest military operation in human history exploded into life. German artillery thundered along the entire front. The Luftwaffe launched devastating strikes against Soviet airfields, destroying nearly 4,000 aircraft in the first week, many of them caught on the ground. Then came the tanks. Panzer divisions, organized into powerful armored spearheads, smashed through Soviet defensive lines and raced deep into Soviet territory. Behind them came hundreds of thousands of infantry soldiers, supported by motorized units and cavalry. The invasion force was staggering in its magnitude. Germany had committed approximately 150 divisions containing 3 million men, about 80% of the entire Wehrmacht. They were joined by Romanian, Finnish, Italian, Hungarian, and other Axis forces, bringing the total to well over 4 million soldiers. Supporting this massive force were over 7,000 artillery pieces, 3,000 tanks, nearly 3,000 aircraft, 600,000 motor vehicles, and remarkably over 600,000 horses. Yes, despite Germany's reputation for mechanization, the Wehrmacht still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. The initial German advance exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. On the first day alone, Heinz Guderian's panzer group drove 50 miles beyond the Soviet frontier. Within 6 days, his tanks had covered 200 miles and captured Minsk, the capital of Belarus. Soviet forces, caught completely by surprise, reeled under the onslaught. Entire armies found themselves encircled in massive cauldron battles, Kesselschlachten in German. At Bialystok and Minsk in the opening weeks, German forces trapped and destroyed numerous Soviet divisions, capturing 300,000 prisoners. But these encirclements, while spectacular, created their own problems. German infantry couldn't keep pace with the racing panzers, allowing many Soviet troops to escape. And those Soviets who were captured created a massive logistical burden for an army whose supply lines were already stretched thin. The advance continued at a breathtaking pace. By mid-July, German forces had penetrated more than 400 miles into Soviet territory. Army Group Center was just 200 miles from Moscow. Victory seemed within grasp. Soviet losses were staggering. In the first weeks, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The Red Army had lost most of its Western tank forces, much of its air force, and countless artillery pieces. Many Western observers believed the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. In August, Hitler made a decision that would spark fierce debate among his generals. Despite being within striking distance of Moscow, he ordered Army Group Center to halt its advance. Instead, he redirected powerful armored forces southward to assist Army Group South in encircling Kiev. His generals protested vehemently. They believed that capturing Moscow, the Soviet capital, transportation hub, and industrial center, should be the primary objective. But Hitler insisted. He wanted to destroy the Red Army-S forces in Ukraine and capture the region's agricultural and industrial resources. The result was the largest encirclement battle in history. In September 1941, German forces surrounded and destroyed 4 complete Soviet armies near Kiev, capturing an astonishing 650,000 prisoners. It was a tactical masterpiece but a strategic blunder. The victory at Kiev came at a cost. Precious weeks had been lost, weeks that could have been used to advance on Moscow before winter arrived. The diversion of forces meant that when the final push toward the Soviet capital began in October, it was already too late. On October 2, 1941, Hitler finally authorized the assault on Moscow, codenamed Operation Typhoon. German forces launched their offensive with confidence. They had crushed every Soviet army they had encountered. Moscow, they believed, would fall before winter. The offensive began with spectacular success. In the battles of Vyazma and Bryansk, German forces encircled and captured another 600,000 Soviet soldiers. The road to Moscow seemed open. By mid-October, advanced German units were just 65 miles from the Kremlin. But then the situation began to change. In October, the autumn rains began. Roads, many of them unpaved, turned into rivers of mud. The Rasputitsa, the season of mud, brought the German advance to a crawling halt. Tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces became hopelessly stuck. Supply columns couldn't reach the front lines. Soldiers went without food, ammunition, and fuel. Then, in early November, the temperature plummeted. The mud froze solid, allowing movement to resume, but it brought new horrors. German soldiers who had expected to be in Moscow by October were not equipped for a Russian winter. They lacked winter clothing, antifreeze for their vehicles, and proper oil for their weapons. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Soldiers suffered from frostbite and exposure, weapons jammed. Tank engines wouldn't start, locomotives froze on the tracks. The vaunted German war machine was grinding to a halt, not defeated by Soviet arms, but by the Russian winter and their own inadequate preparation. The German advance had been so rapid and so deep that it had outrun its own supply lines. Tanks that had raced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory now stood idle for lack of fuel. Soldiers fought with dwindling ammunition. The wounded couldn't be evacuated. Food became scarce. The problem was fundamental. The German military had planned for a quick, decisive victory. They had not prepared for a prolonged campaign deep in enemy territory. Their logistics system simply couldn't support operations at such distances, especially with the Soviet transportation infrastructure largely destroyed and Soviet partisans attacking supply lines. Meanwhile, the Soviets were doing something the Germans hadn't thought possible. They were recovering. What the Germans had failed to understand was the sheer scale and resilience of the Soviet Union. Despite catastrophic losses by December, the Red Army had suffered over 4 million casualties. The Soviets kept fighting. Stalin's scorched earth policy denied the Germans the resources they hoped to capture. Soviet factories were being dismantled and relocated east of the Ural Mountains beyond German reach. In cities like Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, and Novosibirsk, Soviet industry was being rebuilt and expanded at a furious pace. New armies were being raised from the vast Soviet population. Fresh divisions arrived from Siberia and Central Asia. Soviet military production, far from collapsing, was increasing dramatically. And commanding the defense of Moscow was Marshal Georgy Zhukov, one of the finest military minds of the war. Zhukov had been carefully husbanding his reserves, waiting for the right moment to strike. By late November, advanced German units could see the spires of Moscow in the distance. They were just 20 miles from the Kremlin. Some units actually reached the suburbs. It was the closest the Germans would ever get, but they could advance no further. Soviet resistance had stiffened dramatically. Every village, every hill, every frozen forest became a battlefield. Fresh Soviet divisions, many transferred from the Far East after intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack in the East, threw themselves against the exhausted German forces. The German soldiers, freezing, hungry, and depleted, simply couldn't break through. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht's advance had been stopped. Then came the blow that changed everything. On December 5, 1941, Marshal Zhukov launched a massive counteroffensive. Over 500,000 fresh Soviet troops, many equipped with winter gear and supported by new tanks, smashed into the German lines. The Germans, caught completely by surprise, reeled backward. Units that had been attacking Moscow just days before were now fighting desperately to avoid encirclement. The Soviet offensive pushed German forces back over 200 miles in some sectors. For Adolf Hitler and the German High Command, this was a catastrophe. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered. The quick victory they had promised had not materialized. Operation Barbarossa had failed. Hitler issued a controversial stand fast order forbidding any retreat. This probably prevented a complete collapse, but at a terrible cost. German units remained in exposed positions, suffering hideous casualties from Soviet attacks in the brutal winter. By the end of 1941, the German army had suffered over 800,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Some 200,000 German soldiers had died, 10 times the casualties suffered in the Western campaign of 1,940. But the Soviet losses dwarfed even these horrific numbers. By the end of December, the Red Army had suffered over 4 million casualties, with millions more Soviet civilians dead from German atrocities and the brutal occupation policies. The Germans had committed unspeakable war crimes. Special killing units called Einsatzgruppen followed the army, massacring hundreds of thousands of Jews, communists, and civilians. The Commissar Order authorized the immediate execution of captured Soviet political officers. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war died from deliberate starvation, exposure, and execution, one of the worst atrocities in human history. This wasn't just a war of conquest, it was a war of annihilation. Hitler had ordered that this would be different from the wars in Western Europe. This would be a racial war, a war to destroy communism and enslave the Slavic peoples. So why did Operation Barbarossa fail? The reasons are complex and interrelated, but they begin with the fundamental assumptions that underpin the entire operation. Hitler and his generals believed the Soviet Union was weak, that Soviet society would collapse under pressure, that Stalin's purges had crippled the Red Army's officer corps, and that the communist system was fundamentally fragile. They were wrong on every count. They assumed they could win a quick, decisive victory before winter. They assumed that destroying the Red Army's Western forces would mean the end of Soviet resistance. They assumed that the Soviet people would welcome them as liberators from Stalin's tyranny. Instead, German atrocities turned even those Soviets who hated Stalin, like many Ukrainians and Balts who initially did see the Germans as liberators, into determined enemies. The brutal occupation policies ensured that Soviet resistance would only stiffen. The Germans also suffered from strategic confusion at the highest levels. Hitler and his generals disagreed fundamentally about the operation's objectives. Should they focus on capturing Moscow? Or should they prioritize destroying Soviet armies wherever they could be found? Or should they concentrate on seizing economic resources like Ukrainian agriculture and Caucasian oil? This confusion led to costly changes in direction. The diversion to Kiev in August, while tactically successful, may have cost Germany the opportunity to capture Moscow before winter. The constant shifts in priority meant that Germany never concentrated its full strength at the decisive point. Perhaps most critically, the Germans had not prepared for a long war deep in Soviet territory. Their logistics system couldn't support operations at such distances. The Soviet rail system used a different gauge than European railways, forcing time-consuming transfers. Roads were primitive or non-existent. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles through hostile territory. The Germans had planned for their forces to live off the land, but Soviet scorched earth tactics prevented this. They had expected to capture Soviet supplies but found warehouses empty or destroyed. They had anticipated a quick victory but found themselves in a grinding war of attrition for which they were unprepared. The brutal Russian winter exposed every weakness in German planning. Soldiers froze in their summer uniforms. Vehicles and weapons failed in the extreme cold. Movement became nearly impossible through snow and ice. But we must be careful not to blame the failure entirely on winter. The German advance had already been slowing before winter arrived. Soviet resistance was stiffening. German casualties were mounting. Logistical problems were overwhelming. Winter didn't cause Germany's failure. It merely delivered the final blow to an operation already in trouble. Finally, we must acknowledge the incredible resilience and strength of the Soviet Union and its people. Despite suffering losses that would have destroyed any other nation, the Soviets kept fighting. They relocated their industry beyond German reach. They raised new armies, they developed new tactics. They fought with a determination that German planners had never anticipated. Stalin, for all his faults, rallied the Soviet people with appeals to defend Mother Russia. The Red Army, despite its early failures, learned and adapted. Soviet generals like Zhukov proved to be Hitler's equals in operational skill. Operation Barbarossa's failure at the gates of Moscow in December 1941 marked a crucial turning point in World War II. It was Germany's first major defeat on land. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was broken. The quick, decisive victory Hitler had promised had become a grinding war of attrition. Germany now faced what Hitler had always feared, a two-front war. In the West, Britain remained undefeated and was being increasingly supported by American aid. In the East, the Soviet Union had not collapsed but was growing stronger. Just days after the Soviet counteroffensive began, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the war. Hitler compounded his strategic disaster by declaring war on America 4 days later. Germany now faced three great powers: Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. The war in the East would continue for nearly 4 more years, becoming the largest and most destructive conflict in human history. The Eastern Front would see the deaths of over 26 million Soviet citizens and millions of German and Axis soldiers. The battles would grow even larger and more destructive. Stalingrad, Kursk, the siege of Leningrad, each would eclipse even the massive battles of 1941. But the outcome was, in many ways, decided in those crucial months of Operation Barbarossa. Germany had one chance to defeat the Soviet Union quickly, before the full weight of Soviet resources and American aid could be brought to bear. They failed. Every month that the war continued favored the Allies, as their combined industrial might far exceeded Germany's capacity. By 1945, it would be Soviet forces raising their flag over the Reichstag in Berlin, not German troops parading through Red Square in Moscow. Operation Barbarossa stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris, the perils of underestimating one's enemies, and the catastrophic consequences of waging aggressive war. Hitler's certainty that Soviet society would collapse at the first blow proved to be a fatal miscalculation. His ideological hatred blinded him to the strength and determination of the Soviet people. His strategic impatience led him to attack before his forces were adequately prepared. His interference in military operations at crucial moments contributed to the failure. The German military, despite its tactical excellence and operational prowess, had planned for the war they wanted to fight rather than the war they would actually have to fight. They assumed victory and prepared for nothing else. In the end, Operation Barbarossa failed because it was based on false assumptions, plagued by strategic confusion, undermined by inadequate preparation, and opposed by an enemy far stronger and more determined than the Germans had believed possible. It transformed World War II from a European conflict into a truly global struggle. It opened the most destructive theater of the war, and it set in motion the events that would lead to Nazi Germany's total defeat and the Soviet Union's emergence as a superpower. The invasion began at dawn on June 22, 1941, with German confidence at its peak. It ended 5 months later in the frozen forests outside Moscow, with the myth of German invincibility shattered and the road to Berlin opened. The greatest military invasion in human history had become Hitler's greatest strategic disaster, and the world would never be the same.